Lars Eriksen stood on the snow-covered platform outside his cabin in the deep cold of a Montana January, watching thin wisps of smoke escape around the perimeter of the massive metal umbrella that crowned his stone chimney. 200 yards down the valley, Thomas Garrett's cabin belched thick smoke from dawn until dark, as Garrett burned through firewood at twice the rate Lars required, and still complained his fingers went numb indoors. Before we dive into how one Norwegian trapper's obsession with heat loss changed frontier winter survival, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten mountain ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button. The winter of 1849 arrived in the Montana Territory with a cruelty that veteran trappers would remember for decades. Lars Eriksen had built his cabin that previous summer using methods he had learned from other mountain men: notched logs chinked with moss and clay, a simple stone and mud fireplace, a single door hung on leather hinges, and one small window covered with oiled canvas. The structure had seemed adequate during construction. By February, he understood it was a death trap. Lars had immigrated from Norway 3 years earlier, drawn west by stories of fur wealth and open land. He had spent 2 winters working for the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and saved enough to establish his own operation. He met Ingrid in St. Louis, a Norwegian girl working in her uncle's boarding house. They married in the spring of 1848 and traveled west together, reaching the tributaries of the Yellowstone River by late summer. Lars built their cabin in a sheltered valley with good access to beaver streams. Everything seemed promising. The first winter started mild. Through November and December, the cabin stayed tolerably warm with a steady fire. Then January arrived with temperatures that dropped to 30 below zero and stayed there for days at a time. The cabin revealed its fundamental failures. Cold seeped through every gap in the chinking. Frost formed on the interior walls. The canvas window covering grew stiff with ice. Most critically, the fireplace consumed enormous amounts of wood while providing minimal warmth. Lars would build the fire high, but the cabin remained brutally cold. The heat seemed to vanish the moment it was created, rising straight up the chimney and disappearing into the frozen sky. Ingrid developed a cough in mid-January. Lars kept the fire burning constantly, piling on logs, trying to warm the space enough for her to recover. She wrapped herself in every blanket they owned and stayed close to the fireplace, but the cold was relentless. The cough deepened. She developed a fever. Lars rode 2 days through bitter cold to bring back a doctor from the nearest settlement, but the man could do nothing except recommend warmth and rest. Warmth was exactly what Lars could not provide. By early February, Ingrid was struggling to breathe. Lars had burned through nearly his entire winter wood supply. He was cutting fresh wood daily, working himself to exhaustion, feeding the fire constantly. Nothing helped. The cabin stayed cold. The fire consumed wood with insatiable hunger, but produced almost no lasting warmth. On February 9, 1849, Ingrid Eriksen died. She was 23 years old. The cold had killed her as surely as any bullet or blade. Lars buried his wife in ground so frozen he had to build fires to thaw the earth enough to dig. He marked her grave with stones and stood in the bitter wind, understanding with absolute clarity that the cabin had failed them. Not because of poor construction by the standards of mountain cabins, but because the standards themselves were fatally flawed. Heat escaped faster than any fire could generate it. The chimney, meant to provide warmth, was actually throwing their survival into the winter sky with every rising column of smoke. He returned to the empty cabin and sat beside the dying fire, watching heat shimmer up the chimney and vanish. Something broke in Lars that night, or perhaps something locked into place. His grief transformed into obsession. He would understand exactly why cabins stayed cold, and he would fix it. Spring came to the Montana Territory in late March, melting the snow that covered Ingrid's grave. Lars continued running his trap lines with mechanical efficiency, but his mind was no longer focused on beaver pelts or profit. Every cabin he visited, every fire he saw burning, every chimney he passed became an object of intense study. He was searching for answers to a question that consumed him. Where did the heat go? He started by observing his own cabin with methodical attention. On cold mornings, he would light a fire and then step outside to watch the chimney. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. Heat waves shimmered visibly above the chimney top, distorting the air like summer mirages. He could hold his hand 3 feet above the chimney opening and feel intense warmth radiating upward. The heat his fire generated was pouring into the sky at an astonishing rate. Lars began visiting other trappers under the pretense of social calls, but his real purpose was examination. He watched how Wilhelm Schneider's fireplace consumed massive amounts of wood, while the German trapper sat wrapped in furs just 10 feet from roaring flames. He observed Thomas Garrett's cabin, noting how Garrett burned logs the thickness of a man's thigh and still complained about cold feet. He visited Robert MacDonald's place and saw the Scottish trapper's breath visible indoors, despite a fire that had burned continuously for 3 days. The pattern was universal. Every trapper faced the same problem. Fires burned hot, consuming wood at alarming rates, but cabins stayed cold. The men accepted this as simply how winter worked in the mountains. You burned wood, you stayed barely warm enough to survive, and you hoped your supply lasted until spring. Lars could not accept this. There had to be a reason, and if there was a reason, there had to be a solution. He started measuring. He counted how many logs he burned in a day and compared that to how warm his cabin felt. He noted the size of fires other trappers maintained and the temperature they achieved. He began to understand that the relationship between fuel consumed and warmth produced was remarkably inefficient. For every 10 logs he burned, perhaps 1 log's worth of heat actually warmed his living space. The rest vanished. But where? Lars spent hours studying his fireplace, watching flames climb toward the chimney opening. He noticed that the brightest, hottest part of the fire was always at the top, just before the flames entered the chimney throat. That was where the heat was most intense, and that was exactly where it escaped. The chimney, designed to remove smoke, was also removing the majority of the heat his fire produced. The realization was both obvious and devastating. One evening in late April, Lars climbed onto his cabin roof and sat beside the chimney opening. He held his hands over the opening and felt heat pouring out with such intensity he had to pull back. He was burning wood to heat the Montana sky. The chimney was not a heating system. It was a heat disposal system. Everything was backwards, and Ingrid had died because of it. In early June of 1849, Lars packed his spring furs and rode to the nearest settlement, a rough collection of buildings along the Missouri River that served trappers and traders. He sold his pelts for a decent price, but instead of purchasing supplies and heading back to the mountains as he normally would, he stayed. Other trappers thought he was drinking away his grief. Lars was studying. He spent his first day watching the settlement's blacksmith, a thick-armed man named Henderson, who worked iron over a forge that blazed with coal fire. Lars noticed how Henderson positioned his work. The forge had a stone back wall that curved slightly, and Henderson always worked his iron against this wall rather than in the open air. When Lars asked why, Henderson explained without looking up from his hammering. The stone wall reflected heat back onto the work, making the iron heat faster and stay hot longer. Heat that would otherwise escape into the air bounced off the stone and returned to where it was useful. Lars spent hours watching this principle in action. When Henderson heated a piece of iron in the open, it cooled quickly. When he heated the same piece against the stone wall, it stayed workable twice as long. The stone absorbed heat and radiated it back. It was a simple principle, but Lars had never considered it in the context of cabin heating. The next day, Lars studied buildings. He noticed how the general store had a wide roof overhang that extended 3 feet beyond the walls. When rain came, the overhang deflected water away from the foundation. The building stayed dry, not pâteux, because water could not reach it, but because the overhang redirected water before it became a problem. Lars stood in the rain watching water hit the edge of the roof and sheet away from the building. What deflected rain might deflect heat. He examined the settlement's largest building, a warehouse used for storing trade goods. The warehouse had a metal roof, unusual on the frontier where wooden shingles were standard. Lars asked the owner why metal. The man explained that metal did not burn, did not rot, and when properly angled, shed snow and rain more effectively than wood. But he also mentioned something Lars found fascinating. In summer, the metal roof absorbed so much heat from the sun that the warehouse became unbearably hot. The metal took in heat and radiated it into the space below. Lars spent a week in the settlement, observing, asking questions, thinking. He watched how metal reflected and radiated heat. He studied how stone absorbed and held heat. He examined how angled surfaces deflected rain and snow. He was not an educated man, but he understood practical principles when he saw them demonstrated. By the time he prepared to return to the mountains, he had the beginning of an idea. The chimney threw heat into the sky. What if something could catch that heat and send it back down? What if heat could be deflected the way rain was deflected? Lars returned to the mountains in late June with his supplies and a plan that he shared with no one. He spent 2 weeks scouting locations before selecting a site on high ground 50 yards from the creek where he had trapped the previous year. The location was not convenient. Hauling water would require effort, but the site offered visibility in all directions and elevation above potential flooding. Lars had learned that good construction started with good placement. He began by clearing the site and digging. Most mountain men simply stacked logs directly on the ground, accepting that bottom logs would rot within a few years. Lars dug a shallow trench outlining his cabin's footprint, filled it with stones from the creek, and tamped them level. The work took 3 days. When finished, he had a foundation that would prevent settling and keep his logs off the damp earth. It was more effort than necessary by frontier standards, but Lars was no longer building by frontier standards. The chimney occupied his attention next. Standard cabin chimneys were built quickly, usually from river stones mortared with mud, just wide enough to draw smoke efficiently. Lars built his chimney as if it were the cabin's primary feature, rather than an accessory. He selected stones carefully, choosing flat pieces that would stack with minimal gaps. He made the chimney wider than normal, nearly 3 feet across at the base. The additional mass required more stones, more mortar, more time. Lars did not care. He mixed his mortar from clay, sand, and water, adding lime he had brought from the settlement. The lime made the mortar stronger and more weather-resistant than the simple mud mixture most trappers used. He laid each stone with attention to fit and stability, checking that his chimney rose straight and true. The work was slow. A standard chimney might take 2 days to build. Lars spent 2 weeks on his. Other trappers occasionally passed by and stopped to watch. Thomas Garrett rode past one afternoon and observed Lars working on the chimney foundation. Garrett asked why Lars was putting so much effort into a chimney when he had not yet built walls. Lars told him the chimney was the most important part. Garrett laughed and rode on, shaking his head at the Norwegian's strange priorities. Wilhelm Schneider stopped by a week later and watched Lars carefully mortaring stones 15 feet up to the chimney column. Schneider asked if Lars was building a fort or a cabin. Lars explained he was building something that would keep him alive through winter. Schneider did not understand, but wished him well and continued toward his own trap lines. By mid-August, the chimney stood complete, rising 18 feet from the stone platform Lars had constructed at its base. The platform extended 6 feet in front of where his door would be, creating a raised entry area less than a foot high. No railings, just a simple surface that would keep the threshold above snow and mud. The chimney and platform were ready. Now Lars could build his cabin around them. The cabin walls went up quickly once Lars started building them. He notched logs in the traditional style and chinked the gaps with moss and clay. He installed a solid door and cut window openings. The structure was sound and weatherproof. By early September, he had a functional cabin built around the massive stone chimney that dominated its interior. But Lars knew the cabin was only half finished. The innovation that would make it warm still existed only in his mind. In late September, Lars rode back to the settlement with nearly all the money he had earned from his spring fur sales. He went directly to the trading post and placed an order that made the trader stare at him in disbelief. Lars wanted sheet metal, 40 pounds of it, along with iron rod, rivets, and specific tools for metalworking. The cost was enormous, nearly wiping out his season's profit. The trader asked what Lars intended to build. Lars said he was making a chimney cap. The trader looked at the quantity of metal Lars was purchasing and said that was enough metal to roof a small building. Lars confirmed the order and paid. Word spread quickly through the small settlement. The Norwegian trapper was spending a fortune on sheet metal for a chimney cap. Men speculated he had lost his mind to grief. Thomas Garrett was in the settlement selling his own furs when he heard about Lars's purchase. He found Lars loading the heavy metal sheets onto a pack frame and asked directly if Lars had gone insane. A chimney cap was supposed to be a small rain cover, maybe 2 feet, across. What was Lars building? Lars told him he was building something that would keep heat from escaping. Garrett said heat escaped because that was what heat did. You could not trap it. Lars said he was not going to trap it. He was going to redirect it. Garrett walked away, shaking his head. The journey back to his cabin with hundreds of pounds of metal was brutal. Lars made 2 trips, hauling the material on pack horses over rough terrain. By the time he had everything at his cabin site, October had arrived and temperatures were dropping at night. He had perhaps 6 weeks before serious winter weather would make construction dangerous. Lars began by building a wooden frame structure on the ground near his cabin, constructing the skeleton of what would become his cap. He used measurements he had calculated carefully, creating a conical frame 8 feet in diameter, with radial supports extending from a central hub like spokes on a wheel. The frame resembled a giant umbrella lying on its side. Neighbors who saw it confirmed their suspicions. Lars Eriksen had lost his mind. He worked frantically as autumn progressed. The metal sheets needed to be shaped, cut, and formed to fit the frame. The radial supports needed to be attached securely. The entire structure needed to be light enough to mount atop his chimney, yet strong enough to withstand wind. Winter was coming, and Lars was racing against it. The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as warning. Lars worked through increasingly cold days, shaping metal over wooden forms he had constructed. He heated the metal sheets over his fire until they became pliable, then bent them across curved wooden templates, creating sections that would form the conical cap. Each piece had to match precisely. There was no room for error when working at this scale. The radial support structure proved the most challenging aspect. Lars needed the support strong enough to hold the metal sheeting rigid, but light enough that the entire assembly would not collapse his chimney. He used iron rods he had purchased in the settlement, bending them to match the cone's angle and spacing them evenly around the circumference. He riveted the rods to metal plates that would distribute weight across the chimney top. The engineering was instinctive rather than calculated, based on principles he had observed but never formally studied. By mid-November, Lars had completed the frame and was attaching the metal sheeting. He worked on the ground, assembling the cap in sections that he would later raise and join atop the chimney. Each metal panel had to be riveted to the radial supports, creating a structure that was effectively a single piece. The work required precision. Holes had to align perfectly. Rivets had to be set tight. Any gap would allow heat to escape rather than reflect downward. Wilhelm Schneider rode past one afternoon and found Lars hammering rivets in the freezing cold. The German trapper dismounted and walked around the massive metal cone lying on the ground beside Lars's cabin. He asked what in God's name Lars was building. Lars explained it was a heat reflector for his chimney. Schneider asked how it would work. Lars said heat rises from the chimney, hits the metal cap, and bounces back down around the stones instead of escaping into the air. Schneider considered this and said it sounded insane, but he hoped it worked. He rode on, leaving Lars to his riveting. The mounting presented the greatest danger. Lars needed to get the cap atop an 18-foot chimney and secure it firmly. He constructed a wooden scaffold around the chimney, climbing it multiple times to ensure stability. Then he rigged a pulley system using rope and a tree branch, creating a way to lift the heavy metal cap. The work was dangerous. If the cap fell during mounting, it would be destroyed. If Lars fell from the scaffold, he would likely die before anyone found him. On November 20th, with snow threatening and temperatures well below freezing, Lars raised the cap. He pulled it up slowly, using his pulley system, guiding it into position atop the chimney. It took 4 hours of careful work. Finally, the massive umbrella sat in place, extending nearly 3 feet beyond the chimney on all sides. Lars bolted it to the mounting framework he had built into the chimney top. When he climbed down and stepped back to observe his work, he saw something unprecedented on the frontier. Lars stood in his cabin on the morning of November 22nd and prepared to light the first fire under his completed cap. He had spent the previous day checking every connection, ensuring the cap was securely mounted and properly positioned. The metal umbrella sat atop his chimney like some strange mushroom, visible from a quarter-mile away. He knew what was supposed to happen based on principles he had observed. Whether those principles would actually work remained uncertain. He built the fire carefully, starting with kindling and adding larger pieces as flames took hold. Smoke rose toward the chimney opening as it always had. Then Lars noticed the first sign of trouble. Smoke began backing up into the cabin, filling the space with thick, gray clouds. He had anticipated this possibility. The cap was blocking the natural draw. He stepped outside and climbed a scaffold to examine the gap between the cap's edge and the chimney top. The clearance was too small. Smoke could not escape efficiently around the perimeter. Lars had built the cap to redirect heat downward, but he had made the cone angle too shallow and positioned it too close to the chimney opening. He needed to raise the cap slightly and adjust its angle. He worked quickly, despite the smoke continuing to pour from his cabin door. Using wooden shims, he lifted the cap 2 inches and tilted it to increase the gap on all sides. He climbed down and went back inside. The smoke was already clearing. The chimney was drawing properly now, pulling smoke up and allowing it to escape around the cap's perimeter while the cap itself blocked the upward escape of heat. Lars added more wood to the fire and waited. Within an hour, he noticed the difference. The cabin was warming faster than it ever had with similar fires. He stepped outside and placed his hand on the stone chimney. The exterior stones were warm to the touch, far warmer than they had ever been with his old open chimney. Heat was accumulating beneath the metal cap, radiating downward, warming the chimney's exterior. Those stones were absorbing the heat and conducting it through to the interior. By afternoon, Lars was measuring temperatures with a simple thermometer he had purchased in the settlement. The outside air was 15 degrees above zero. His cabin interior registered 65 degrees, with a fire no larger than he would have normally maintained. The difference was remarkable. He was achieving comfortable warmth with a fraction of the wood he had burned the previous winter. As evening fell, Lars reduced his fire to a modest burn and monitored the temperature. The cabin stayed warm. The metal cap above continued to radiate captured heat downward. The stone chimney glowed with stored thermal energy. Lars sat beside his fire and thought about Ingrid, about the cold that had killed her, about the wasted heat that had poured uselessly into the winter sky. His chimney no longer threw heat away. It captured heat and returned it to where it was needed. The principle worked. The insane umbrella functioned exactly as he had hoped. January of 1850 brought cold that rivaled the previous year's brutality. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks. This was the test Lars had been waiting for. The conditions that would prove whether his cap truly worked or whether he had wasted his time and money on an elaborate failure. Thomas Garrett's cabin, 200 yards down the valley, became a benchmark for comparison. Garrett burned wood from dawn until well after dark, feeding his fireplace constantly. Thick smoke poured from his chimney in a continuous column. Despite this effort, Garrett complained to anyone who would listen that his cabin stayed barely tolerable. He wore furs indoors, and his water bucket developed ice overnight. Lars burned half the wood Garrett used and maintained a cabin warm enough to move comfortably in shirt sleeves. He kept careful records, noting outside temperature, inside temperature, wood consumed, and fire size. The numbers confirmed what he felt. His cabin averaged 30 degrees warmer than the outside air, with fires that other trappers would consider inadequate for survival. The massive metal cap was capturing heat that would have escaped and reflecting it downward around the stone chimney. The chimney stones absorbed this heat and radiated it continuously into the cabin interior. Wilhelm Schneider stopped by in late January, seeking to borrow supplies. He stepped into Lars's cabin and immediately removed his fur coat. The warmth was shocking compared to the bitter cold outside. Schneider asked how this was possible. Lars explained the cap's function. Heat rises, hits the metal, reflects downward, warms the stones. Stones radiate into the room. Schneider walked outside and studied the cap for 10 minutes, then came back inside and asked detailed questions about construction. Lars answered everything freely. Robert MacDonald's situation became desperate in early February. The Scottish trapper's cabin suffered from severe downdrafts that actually pulled cold air down his chimney during high winds. Ice formed on his interior walls. His wife Sarah was ill, the same symptoms Ingrid had shown the year before. MacDonald rode to Lars's cabin and asked if Lars could help. Lars went to MacDonald's cabin and immediately identified the problem. The chimney had no cap at all, allowing wind to push directly down into the fireplace. Lars could not build MacDonald a metal cap in the middle of winter, but he helped MacDonald construct a temporary wooden cover that at least blocked direct downdrafts. The improvement was immediate. MacDonald's cabin warmed by 15 degrees within hours. Sarah began recovering. MacDonald asked if Lars would help him build a proper cap come spring. Lars agreed. By late February, 3 other trappers had visited Lars's cabin to see the cap for themselves. Henry Clayton, an American trapper who had studied engineering before coming west, examined the system carefully and pronounced the physics sound. Thomas Garrett, who had mocked Lars's metal purchase 4 months earlier, asked quietly if Lars would share his design. The winter that was supposed to prove Lars insane had instead proven him right. The impossible had become undeniable. Spring arrived in late March of 1850, and with the thaw came a steady stream of visitors to Lars's cabin. Trappers who had dismissed his metal umbrella as madness now wanted to understand how it worked. Lars welcomed every visitor and explained the principles freely. He had not built the cap to profit from the design. He had built it to survive. If others could benefit from what he had learned, he considered that a worthy outcome. Wilhelm Schneider was the first to begin construction on his own cap. He arrived in early April with questions about measurements and materials. Lars showed him the wooden frame structure he had used as a template and explained the radial support pattern. Schneider took careful notes and asked about the cone angle. Lars explained that the angle needed to be shallow enough to reflect heat downward, but steep enough to shed snow and allow smoke to escape around the perimeter. 30 to 40 degrees from horizontal seemed optimal. Robert MacDonald came next, bringing measurements of his chimney and asking about the mounting system. Lars explained how he had built the support framework into the chimney. top and how the weight distributed across the stone structure. MacDonald was concerned about whether his chimney could support the cap's weight. Lars examined MacDonald's chimney and confirmed it was solid enough if MacDonald reinforced the top courses with additional mortar and added a stone cap platform. Henry Clayton visited, not to build a cap, but to discuss the physics. He and Lars spent an afternoon talking about heat reflection, thermal mass, and convection. Clayton sketched diagrams showing how heat radiated from the cap downward and how the chimney stones absorbed and stored that energy. He calculated that Lars's system recaptured approximately 60% of the heat that would normally escape up an open chimney. The improvement in efficiency explained why Lars used half the firewood of his neighbors. By late spring, 4 trappers in the territory were building caps modeled on Lars's design. Wilhelm Schneider completed his in June, using tin sheeting instead of iron because it was lighter and easier to work. Robert MacDonald finished his in July, making the cone angle steeper than Lars's design because he worried about snow accumulation. Thomas Garrett, who had mocked Lars most openly, began his construction in August. He visited Lars 3 times, asking questions, and each time thanked Lars for sharing the knowledge freely. Word of the caps spread beyond the immediate trapping community. Traders carried stories back to settlements. A newspaper in the territorial capital published a brief article about Norwegian trappers building unusual chimney structures that dramatically improved cabin heating. The article called them Eriksen caps, though Lars had never claimed ownership of the design. By autumn of 1850, 7 cabins in the Montana Territory had heat-reflecting chimney caps. The technique was spreading organically, shared freely among men who understood that survival knowledge belonged to everyone. Lars had not set out to change frontier architecture. He had set out to prevent another death like Ingrid's. The caps spreading across the mountains suggested he was succeeding. The winter of 1850 to 1851 passed with notably fewer deaths from cold-related illness in the trappers' cabins equipped with heat-reflecting caps. Wilhelm Schneider's German-built cap performed flawlessly, keeping his cabin warm through January temperatures that reached 35 below zero. Robert MacDonald's wife Sarah remained healthy all winter, a stark contrast to her near-fatal illness the previous year. Thomas Garrett grudgingly admitted his cabin had never been more comfortable, and his firewood consumption had dropped by more than half. Over the following years, the design continued to evolve and spread. Some trappers built caps from copper sheeting, which reflected heat more efficiently than iron but cost significantly more. Others experimented with different cone angles, discovering that steeper angles shed heavy snow better while shallower angles reflected more heat downward. A few builders added adjustable mounting systems that allowed the cap height to be changed seasonally, raising it in summer for better ventilation and lowering it in winter for maximum heat capture. By 1855, the technique had spread beyond the trapping community into the broader settlement population. Homesteaders building permanent cabins incorporated heat-reflecting caps into their construction plans. A blacksmith in Fort Benton began fabricating caps commercially, offering 3 standard sizes for different chimney dimensions. The caps were no longer called Eriksen caps. They were simply known as reflector caps or heat caps, the specific innovation absorbed into general frontier building knowledge. The principles Lars had discovered found applications beyond chimney caps. Builders began constructing stone chimneys with greater mass, specifically to absorb and radiate heat. Some incorporated metal sheeting into chimney interiors to reflect more heat into living spaces before it could escape. The fundamental insight that heat could be captured and redirected rather than simply vented became standard wisdom among anyone building in cold climates. Lars himself continued trapping through the 1850s, eventually acquiring enough capital to purchase land and establish a small ranch near the Yellowstone River. He married again in 1857, a widow named Christina, who had emigrated from Sweden. They built a house with a properly designed heating system, incorporating everything Lars had learned. The house stayed comfortably warm through the harshest winters while using a fraction of the wood typical homes required. By 1865, when the fur trade had largely collapsed and the frontier was transitioning to ranching and farming, heat-reflecting chimney caps were common enough that no one considered them unusual. Travelers passing through Montana and Wyoming territory saw them on cabins and houses throughout the region and assumed they had always been part of frontier architecture. The name Lars Eriksen appeared in no histories of the period. He left no patents, no published papers, no formal documentation of his innovation. What remained were the cabins themselves, scattered across the Rocky Mountain territories, their distinctive umbrella-capped chimneys, silent testament to one man's refusal to accept that cold was inevitable. Lars Eriksen had lost his wife to inadequate shelter. His response was not vengeance or despair, but methodical engineering. He studied the problem, developed a solution, and shared it freely. Lives were saved not through heroism, but through captured heat, redirected downward on winter nights.